Thank you very much for coming, and I would like to thank Professor Makolilo in particular and the conference organizers for inviting me to speak. So, over the past 40 years, the world has made remarkable progress in advancing women's rights. But the international system that helped make many of these gains possible is now undergoing profound changes. Multilateral institutions are weakening. Global politics is becoming more transactional. Authoritarian governments are gaining influence, and foreign aid regimes are declining. So I want to ask a simple but very important question. What happens to women's rights when the global order that helped support them begins to unravel? For much of the post-World War II period, global politics operated within what we call a rules-based international order. The system was built around multilateral institutions, around international law, alliances among democratic states, and shared commitments to human rights, including women's rights. That order was never perfect. It did not benefit all countries equally. It was often deeply political, as countries like the United States sought to extend their power. But it did create institutions, norms, and funding structures that women's movements around the world were able to use to advance their agendas. International conferences, UN frameworks, foreign aid programs, and transnational advocacy networks all played important roles. But before we talk about the current moment, it's important to remember just how much progress has been made. Beginning in the 1980s and 1990s in particular, international institutions became major engines for advancing women's rights. In 1979, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women was a landmark international treaty. It was passed, and governments around the world committed to improving women's status and eliminate discrimination against women in areas like education, employment, healthcare, and family life. Also, one of the most important developments came in the year 2000 with the adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. And this is a treaty that African countries like Namibia helped initiate. The resolution was revolutionary because it recognized that it's something that women activists have long argued, that women aren't simply victims of conflict, but they're also essential actors in peace building, even often very much in invisible ways, but nevertheless they've played a role in grassroots peace building. And the call was for their inclusion in all peace building activities at all levels, not just at the grassroots, but also at the international and national level. Also, there were major UN conferences on women, beginning with the Mexico City Conference in 1975. And these conferences provided key milestones for advancing women's rights. The Beijing Conference in 1995, in particular, created a global framework for advancing gender equality, especially when it came to women's political representation. International donors and multilateral organizations invested significant resources into these efforts. And in many countries, domestic activists were able to leverage these international frameworks to push for national reforms. Here in Tanzania, you had Honorable Gertrude Mongella. I just saw her last week. She was the Secretary General of this the fourth UN, United Nations Conference on Women in 1995. And this conference, she played a very key role, along with many other African leaders, in pushing for the girl-child agenda, but also for women's political representation. But what we've seen over the last 40 years is gender gaps in education, for example, have been closing. Maternal mortality has declined in many regions. Women's political representation has increased. And there's been much more awareness of gender-based violence. I mean, you can hardly open up a newspaper here in Tanzania without seeing an article on gender-based violence. So, you know, this was not the case. I've lived in Tanzania for a long time. I grew up here, and if you go back to my youth, you know, the Daily Standard is what we read, and there was no such article. So, you know, you can tell that things have dramatically changed in terms of women's rights and awareness of them, at least. But now we're in a different moment, and you know, we had the UN Charter after World War II, that was a treaty that provided an overall framework for the United Nations system, a foundation for international law governing the use of force, peaceful settlements of disputes, arms control, and other important functions to help maintain peace and security at the international level. The UN Charter called for universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. But now all of these values and norms are being openly questioned, including by the very actors who once helped shape and uphold that framework. And here I'm talking about the United States in particular, which was a major force for you know, the creation of the system, the multilateral system that we have had for so long. And the international system was built, at least, on the understanding that restraint and self-restraint served the collective interest of states. Of course, it was never lived up to. It was an ideal, but that understanding and the premise, at least, is no longer now widely shared. And instead of long-term partnerships that built around shared values, the international relations are now increasingly organized around short-term deals and strategic interests. And these have profound implications for gender equality, among other issues. And so what we're seeing now is a world that's increasingly characterized by multipolarity, but the question is what kind? I mean, when we're kind of at a moment where we're asking, you know, what kind of multipolarity? The world was multipolar from the beginning of the 1900s to end of World War II. Then it became a bipolar, you know, U.S.-Soviet world between 45 and 1991, and then became kind of more unipolar after 91 up until 2008. And since 2008, it's been, you know, more, you could say, a multipolar world. And some would argue that the competition is between China, Russia, and the United States. But other voices are saying, no, this is a moment to really rethink this world of ours, and that it should shift, and it could shift towards the global south, with countries like India playing a critical role in determining that future order. And some see a future that's much more, you know, based on cooperation and a multilateral system that's based on rules rather than simply raw power, which is what we're seeing now today. And so one vision is that the power would be distributed across networks rather than a single hegemon through a series of alliances and groupings. But all of this remains very much in question, and the future is you know, very much a question mark. And right now, a lot of what we see are the dangers of where we're heading. And these changes have resulted in record levels of militarization and military spending, military priorities taking over humanitarian concerns, which all have serious implications for women. So one of the consequences of this changing order is the rising number of regional and other conflicts and coup d'etat, electoral repression, and the rise of big power, strong-arm policies taking over. Multilateral cooperation is very much, you know, in question. And, you know, this is a system, so. And the U.S., for example, is acting increasingly unilaterally. The U.S. pulled out of 66 multilateral organizations, including UN Women and UN Population Fund. It abolished the U.S. Agency for International Development, and now it's withdrawing its traditional commitments to women's rights, women's peace building, and human rights more generally. Pulled out of all kinds of major UN organizations, the World Food Program, UNICEF, UNHCR, WHO, and I can go on, suspending operations in many cases. Or the UN agencies have had to suspend operations or scale back their services and cut staff. And all of this has affected women, refugees, migrants, children, vulnerable populations. As a result of, in part, as a result of U.S. activities, European countries have also reduced development and humanitarian aid, partly to redirect their budgets towards military budgets. And then, of course, some have taken a more right-wing turn, like Sweden and Netherlands. So the future of aid is very volatile at best. The developing countries have cut aid by 23% just in the 1 year between 2024 and 2025. Germany, United States, UK, Japan, and France accounted for the bulk of this, 96% of this total decline that we've seen. And US drove 3/4 of that decline. So this is now made, by default, Germany, the world's largest donor. But it too has cut aid by 17% and plans to cut more. Sweden. The other thing that we see is the aid is becoming much more transactional and very explicitly geopolitical. Of course, it's always been that way, but now it's explicitly so. And United States in particular has, of course, it's always had a political dimension to its aid, and it never was just pure humanitarianism. But this transactional nature is extremely explicit now. Some countries like Zimbabwe and Zambia have pushed back against agreements due to their concerns about sovereignty and external oversight. I think the High Court in Kenya also put the health aid on hold because U.S. is just asking, we'll give you health aid, but then we want your minerals and your health data, for example. So 80% of USAID programs were terminated or suspended when USAID was dissolved. And aid priorities, to the extent that they still exist, are focusing really on national security interests and economic interests rather than human rights or gender equality, for example. And in other areas, U.S. has taken out the term gender, it's banned it from all federal policies. We've had to take it out of all of our grants that we get from the government. U.S. rejected the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, including the one on gender equality. So the consequences of this, it's affecting everybody, all of us. And one of the consequences has been that women's organizations now are facing severe funding cuts. And a recent survey by UN Women shows that the large majority of women's organizations, about 80%, have had to reduce their programming or suspend their programs. They've resulted in layoffs. They can't plan long term. And basically, they're operating under what some call a survival mode. In Tanzania, we may be seeing the collapse of the NGO sector altogether. Maybe that's too extreme, but at least it's being very seriously affected. And in general, USAID cuts have severely targeted women-focused programming. In particular, 88% cuts to maternal and child health funding, 94% to sexual and reproductive health funding, 80% cut to gender-based violence programs. And this is not to mention all the general programs that also affect women in particular, who have to take 10 to the households and get water and so on. At the same time, women are also affected by the rise in militarism, and with the increase in military spending and the cuts in funding for peace building, several peacekeeping programs have been cut or pulled back significantly. And there's then been documented massive increases in conflict-related sexual violence, including the rape of women and girls, which is related to the fact that there's less attention being given to these cutbacks. In Tanzania here, I've been talking to different women's organizations. I'm in the middle of a project looking at what's happening here. And it's you know, it's a pretty dire situation from what I can tell. USAID used to contribute 2.64 trillion Tanzanian shillings to national development per year. And 85% of the organizations here that relied on foreign funding have experienced major impacts. Staff suspensions, terminations, budgets have been reduced by 90% in some cases, leading to office closures, halting of projects, weakening of community engagement, and critical setbacks in the PEPFAR HIV/AIDS initiatives and programs targeting women and other vulnerable populations. There's been a suspension of governance programs like USAID's Wanawake Sasa, and this is undermining women's and youth political participation. I'm not finding much evidence of the government stepping in to fill in the gaps, and many organizations are finding it hard to find alternatives. And also the cuts were so abrupt, they came overnight, there was no way to even plan. But as elsewhere in the world, women's organizations have been hit very hard, especially in the health sector, legal aid, economic empowerment, and civic and political participation programs. So, I mean, where does this leave us? It leaves us with a question. More than I have more questions than I have answers, but you know, it's a moment to really ponder and think about where we go from here. One consequence is that we're going to have to rely much more on grassroots activities of women's organizations. And we're going to have to think up new models that perhaps emphasize this local leadership, local solutions to problems, grassroots solutions to problems. Already we're seeing this in the countries that have been affected by war, that some of the most vital solutions are coming from these grassroots peace-building organizations that really are, you can find all over. Also, there'll have to be more domestic resource mobilization. And there the onus is on the state, perhaps, to direct that. Deeper partnerships between states and civil society where possible. A lot of organizations are talking about collaborating to build efficiencies, but more coordination between organizations. But that, again, is difficult at a moment where everybody is now competing for whatever other funds are available. But I think that people are talking much more and thinking ahead in terms of how do we build more sustainable financial funding mechanisms and not to be so donor dependent. And many organizations were dependent almost entirely, like 80% of some of them were entirely dependent on USAID or other donors. And so, I think that there's been much more discussion. But at the international level, there also have to be changes, and I think that these point to the need for more voice to the global south in the United Nations and in other global institutions. The pressures for UN Security Council reform have never been more important. Revising global trade and financial institutions, all of these are critical to address. But right now, we really are at a crossroads, and it's an important time for institutions like the University of Dar es Salaam to have a discussion about, where do we go? How do we think about how we move ahead? Can we rethink old paradigms? Can we reset the way that we've considered questions of donor-partner relations? And it's a real moment to think creatively about how we move ahead. So thank you very much.
More applause, please. Thanks very much. Our second panelist is Joanne Sabahene, please.